Andrew Johns didn't just dislike some guys. He flat out said, "I can't stand him." And over his career, there were 5 names that brought out something darker, something personal. One of these rivalries ended with him needing 27 stitches after getting knocked out cold during an Origin fight. Another was a sledging war so vicious that teammates had to be told to ignore the noise and just focus on the game. But here's the thing nobody really talks about. Andrew Johns was a genius who could also act like a bully. And these 5 feuds tell you everything about who he was. The 1990s rugby league wasn't like today. It was tougher, meaner, and way more tribal. Johns debuted for Newcastle during a time when the sport was transitioning from old school amateur grit into a massive commercial enterprise. The halfback position had become something new. Johns himself changed what the role could be. He had a revolutionary kicking game. He had tactical vision that made him control matches with his brain alone. He had swagger, and that swagger made him a target. If you're already hooked by these stories, hit that hype feature right now and give this video some hype. Because these 5 rivalries are about to show you exactly what made Johns dangerous, and exactly what made him impossible to respect sometimes. This is about the moments when talent crossed the line, when competing became something uglier. Let's start with the early warning signs. Number 5. Chris Mortimer. Before Johns became the legend, before he became somebody people actually feared, he was just a confident kid coming into a sport that didn't like confident kids. The game in the early 1990s had unwritten rules, and one of them was that you didn't swagger until you earned the right to swagger. Johns had talent, but he didn't have the years yet. Chris Mortimer represented something older, something that the 1980s had left behind. Mortimer was legendary for his toughness and his uncompromising defensive style. He was part of an old guard that viewed Johns' flashy approach as disrespectful, like the kid was saying that everything the old guys didn't matter anymore. When Johns was establishing himself at Newcastle in the early 90s, matches against veterans like Mortimer were exercises in putting the kid in his place. This wasn't about football. This was about hierarchy. Mortimer didn't appreciate Johns' confidence and showed that through physical intimidation. He tested Johns repeatedly, hitting him late and hard, making sure the younger player knew that talent alone wouldn't let you survive. But Johns didn't back down. He absorbed the punishment and kept coming back. This early exposure helped forge the mental toughness that eventually made Johns nearly impossible to rattle. The thing is, this conflict was necessary. As much as it was about arrogance and testing boundaries, it was also about a young player refusing to be intimidated by reputation. Johns was cocky. Yeah, but he was cocky because he was that good. And when the old guard couldn't slow him down through violence alone, they had to accept that the game was changing. Number 4, Steve and Kerrod Walters. State of Origin isn't rugby league. It's something else entirely. By the mid-1990s, Andrew Johns was entering this arena as a young superstar, and Queensland didn't care that he was brilliant. They cared that he was New South Wales. The Walters brothers, Steve and Kerrod, represented Queensland's old guard, the hookers who had defined the position during the Brisbane Broncos era. They didn't need to like Johns. They needed to break him. The strategy was simple and brutal. Johns was identified immediately as the engine of New South Wales. If you could disrupt Johns, you disrupted everything. So Queensland made a choice: target him physically, make him think about his safety instead of playmaking, force him to worry about surviving instead of creating. This was systematic tactical war. The Walters brothers were the executors of that strategy. They hit Johns late after he passed the ball. They targeted him in the ruck. They made sure that every time he tried to create, he paid a physical price. Kerrod Walters in particular was known for a rugged style of play that fit perfectly into Queensland's approach. When Johns debuted for New South Wales, he became public enemy number 1 in the Origin arena. The toll of these matches was visible. Johns' face would swell. His body would absorb punishment that modern players don't experience anymore. But here's the thing worth noting and worth criticising. Johns participated in this culture. He accepted that this was the price of playing at this level. He didn't complain. He came back for more. And that willingness to absorb punishment without complaint actually enabled the culture to continue. The Walters brothers weren't unique in this approach. This was Queensland Rugby League. This was how they maintained their dominance. Number 3, Terry Hill Newcastle versus Manly wasn't just a game. It was tribal warfare dressed up in rugby league uniforms. By the mid to late 1990s, these two clubs had a rivalry that went beyond anything rational. When these two sides met, people lost perspective. Games that should have been forgotten became personal narratives that lasted for years. Terry Hill was the most prolific sledger in rugby league history. His verbal assaults were described as not fit for publication, which is a way of saying they were absolutely vicious and designed to burrow into your brain and make you doubt yourself. Hill's role on the field was to get inside Johns' head, to make him angry, to make him lose focus, and he brought backup. Ricky Stewart, another Manly player, worked alongside Hill to create a relentless barrage of psychological warfare. Stewart once mocked Johns by saying he was weak for not taking a pay cut to keep his brother Matty at the club. The goal was to make Johns feel small, to make him feel like his talent didn't matter, to make him rage. Hill's favourite line was simple: "You're a reserve grader." He'd say it over and over, dismissing Johns' accomplishments with a phrase designed to lodge itself in your confidence like a splinter. And it worked sometimes. Johns would get angry. He'd get caught up in the personal nature rather than just playing football. In a 1999 opener at Stadium Australia, Hill scored first, trying to set the tone. Then Johns took over, scoring a try and kicking a field goal to help Newcastle win 41-18. The violence that accompanied this was staggering. Tony Butterfield, a Newcastle prop, was accused of spitting on Terry Hill during a 1997 semi-final. Butterfield claimed it was accidental, but then said something revealing: "When the game starts, we just want to tear each other's heads off." That's the mentality that defined this era. The sledging was psychological, yes, but it was designed to push everyone toward genuine violence. Malcolm Riley, the Newcastle coach, had to specifically instruct his players not to let Manly's sledging distract them. And Johns' response to all this? Sometimes he was brilliant and rose above it. Sometimes he got sucked in and let his ego take over. Both versions of Johns existed in this rivalry. Number 2, Jamie Goddard and the Cattle Dog. The 1997 State of Origin Series Game 3 produced the single most famous physical confrontation of Andrew Johns' career. This is the moment that separates Johns' story into before and after. This is the moment that people still talk about decades later. And this moment reveals everything ugly about the era and about Johns' participation in a culture that valued toughness over sense. Jamie Goddard was an honest Queensland rake, a hard-working forward who would have been forgotten entirely if not for what happened in this match. Goddard is remembered because of 27 stitches and one perfectly timed punch that dropped the 8th Immortal flat on his back. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't a random brawl. This was orchestrated violence. The New South Wales coach was Tommy Raudonikis, and Raudonikis had a strategy. In a scrum, he would scream a code word from the sideline. That code word was cattle dog. When cattle dog was screamed, every NSW player was supposed to engage in an all-in brawl. The logic was that a fight would unsettle Queensland and demonstrate NSW physical dominance. It was a calculated tactical maneuver disguised as spontaneous violence. When Raudonikis screamed cattle dog, NSW forwards responded instantly. Mark Carroll, called Spud, stood up in the pack and smashed Craig Smith between the eyes, knocking him completely out. That was the signal. That was the moment everything became chaos. In that chaos, Andrew Johns and Jamie Goddard found themselves facing each other. In that first exchange, Johns believed he was winning. He landed several hits on Goddard before they were separated. Johns was feeling the adrenaline, feeling like he was dominant. But then something happened that Johns didn't anticipate. He was fueled by the cattle dog call. He was fueled by the need to prove NSW toughness. He sidestepped the touch judge who was trying to separate them and went hunting for a second dig. Johns literally went back into the fight looking for another round. That was his mistake. As Johns approached Goddard for the second time, Goddard landed a perfectly timed right jab directly on Johns' face. Johns went down hard, knocked completely out cold. When he woke up, his lip was torn open in a way that required 27 stitches to repair. 20 on the outside, 7 on the inside. Dr. Nathan Gibbs administered those stitches while Johns tried to process what had happened. He'd been beaten, he'd been embarrassed, and it was his own overconfidence that caused it. But the cattle dog incident didn't end there. The aftermath in the dressing sheds was brutal. Johns was still groggy from the knockout, still not thinking straight. He fell asleep on the bench while being treated. Tommy Raudonikis, the same coach who had orchestrated the entire brawl, woke Johns up by yelling at him. Raudonikis berated him, screamed at him, and then ordered him back out onto the field. Despite his injuries, despite his lip being split open, despite the fact that his mouthguard couldn't even fit because of the swelling, Johns went back out. And this is where Johns' reputation for toughness becomes something to criticize, not admire. Johns returned to the field while severely injured because of a cultural expectation that had been built over decades. Letting down the tribe was worse than breaking your body. Physical suffering was a badge of honor, and the system had trained Johns to accept this. There's a surreal footnote to the cattle dog incident. Both Johns and Goddard were represented by the same lawyer, Jeff Bellew, in the judiciary hearing. Think about that. They were supposed to be adversaries, but they shared legal counsel. The outcome was that both received 2-week suspensions, an almost symmetrical punishment for an asymmetrical fight. But what's remarkable is what happened next. Johns and Goddard shook hands and swapped jerseys in the sheds after the match. This was the code of the era. You could absolutely destroy each other on the field and then be mates in the sheds. Goddard has reflected on the incident with humility over the years, calling it a lucky punch and saying that he still keeps Johns' jersey at home as a prized possession. There's mutual respect there. There's even affection. But there's also a troubling truth. The culture that led to Johns getting knocked out and returning to play while severely injured was never really challenged or changed. It just became a story. Number 1, Brett Finch. By 2004, rugby league was different. The early brutality of the 1990s had evolved into something more modern, more professional in some ways, but still deeply competitive. Brett Finch was the Sydney Roosters' halfback, and Finch represented the next generation of playmakers who grew up watching Johns and refused to be intimidated by his reputation. Finch was cocky in his own right. Finch believed he was elite, and when Newcastle played Sydney, these two playmakers engaged in a different kind of rivalry. The 2004 season was tumultuous for Johns. There was contract speculation, there were injury concerns, there was a high-profile offer to switch to rugby union. When he played Sydney, he was frustrated. He was desperate. He was feeling his mortality in a way he hadn't before. The Roosters were dominant. Newcastle was struggling. Johns was dealing with the reality that maybe his era was ending. On-field microphones captured Johns and Finch screaming at each other during that 2004 clash. This wasn't subtle sledging. This wasn't the calculated psychological warfare of Terry Hill. This was two elite playmakers losing decorum, screaming because they were frustrated and angry and wanted to establish dominance. It looked like a breakdown of professional conduct. It looked personal in a way that felt different from earlier rivalries. The context mattered. In 2003, the Roosters had beaten Newcastle narrowly in a high-error match. The Roosters' strategy was to use aggressive defensive line speed to negate Johns' kicking time, to rush up on him before he could execute his tactical genius. Johns, returning from a broken back, was physically vulnerable. The Roosters targeted that vulnerability. So when 2004 came around, the animosity had been built. Johns was frustrated. Finch wanted to beat him, and they screamed at each other like two competitors who'd lost the ability to contain their anger. But here's what happened that separates the Finch rivalry from the Goddard rivalry, from the Walters rivalry from the Hill rivalry. Johns and Finch eventually worked together in the media. Both became prominent figures on television. They appeared together on the Matty Johns show, on Fox League programs. They had to reconcile. And in that reconciliation, something shifted. Johns and Finch began to respect each other's tactical knowledge. The screaming match of 2004 became a story they could laugh about. The intensity that had seemed like personal hatred was revealed to be white line fever, the kind of competitiveness that burns hot during a match and cools down once you're out of uniform. This evolution from bitter adversaries to media collaborators isn't unique to Johns and Finch. It's common in rugby league, but it matters because it suggests something important about Johns' entire career. The rivalries that seemed so vicious and personal at the time weren't necessarily rooted in lasting animus. They were professional intensity. They were the competition between elite athletes who needed to dominate to survive. The hatred that fans perceived was actually just very, very good rugby league players refusing to lose. So what does this all mean? Andrew Johns provoked conflict because he was swagger personified. He was technically brilliant, yes, but he was also arrogant. He was willing to cross lines. He participated in a culture that valued toughness over sense. He got knocked out by Jamie Goddard and went back out to play. He screamed at Brett Finch. He absorbed physical punishment without complaint. He let Terry Hill get under his skin sometimes and responded with pure anger rather than grace. Johns' legacy isn't diminished by these flaws. If anything, it's complicated by them. The same competitive fire that made him a target was also what made him great. The same swagger that created enemies was necessary to dominate at the highest level. The same willingness to absorb punishment was what separated good players from immortals. Matty Johns, his brother, helped humanize these rivalries by telling them as comedic anecdotes, by pulling back and showing the humanity underneath the violence. And slowly, the narrative shifted. The person who seemed like a bully or a hothead when he was playing was revealed to be someone whose intensity was contextual, whose hatred was professional, whose greatest weakness was never knowing when to stop. These 5 rivalries, from Mortimer to Goddard, to the Walters brothers, to Terry Hill, to Brett Finch, they forged Andrew Johns into the 8th immortal. They weren't distractions from his genius. They were the environment that necessitated his excellence, and in the end, every one of those adversaries came to respect him. That respect didn't erase the ugly moments, but it contextualized them. Like this video, subscribe for more rugby league deep dives, and comment which of these rivalries was truly the wildest. Thanks for watching.